and we'll be starting with Dr. Candice Gaia's talk. Her talk is titled The Lived Realities of Indigenous Language Learners in Canada and Beyond. Candice Kalemamu Wahine Kapu Gala, Kanaka Hawaii and Filipino, is an associate professor in the Department of Language and Literacy, Faculty of Education, and the First Nations and Endangered Languages program in the Institute for Critical Indigenous Studies, Faculties of Art, at the University of British Columbia on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Hakemelam speaking Musqueam people. Her scholarship emphasizes Hawaiian language and Indigenous languages at the intersection of language, revitalization, digital technology, and cultural practices, and decolonizing and indigenizing the academy to create pathways for Indigenous thinkers and scholars. Welcome, Dr. Gaia.
Aloha mai kākou. I want to begin with an oli, Makolelo Hawaii. Kuni ka mauna I ka la'i e o wai ale ale la I wai lua. Hukia ela I ka lani ka papa au wai o ka waikini. A lai ia ela e no nalo ka ipu ha'a ka laula mau ka ka pa'a e. Mai pa'a I ka leo. He ole ka hea mai e. Aloha mai kākou, o wau no o Candice Kalemamu o Wahine Kapu Gala, o Hawaii ku'u one aha no. He polopeka ma ke kula nui o Kolomepia Pelekania ma ka aina pono'i o ka lā hui Musqueam. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm delivering this presentation from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Hunkamina Musqueam-speaking people. I'd also like to recognize that this gathering, as was shared at the very beginning of this workshop, is being hosted at the University of Toronto. And I wish to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River, which is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. And last but not least, I'd like to recognize my traditional homelands of Hawaii, which has provided me first and foremost with my foundation in Olelo, Hawaii, language, mo'omeheu, culture, and ike, knowledge. My presentation is titled The Current and Lived Realities of Indigenous Language Learners in Canada and Beyond. The language that I began with, Olelo Hawaii, is the Indigenous language of Hawaii. Many of us know Hawaii as a vacation destination. However, what is less known is Hawaiian language was banned from the educational system in 1896, 3 years after the illegal overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom by the United States government. These actions, among other factors, have contributed to language decline, so much so that generations of Kanaka, or Native Hawaiians like myself, did not have the opportunity to acquire Hawaiian as a first language. In the 1980s, there were less than 50 children under the age of 18 who were native speakers of Hawaiian. Well, how does this apply to us here today? When we look at diversity, 97% of the world's population speaks about 4% of the world's languages. These include dominant languages like English, French, Spanish, Arabic. And the remaining 3% of the world population speaks 96% of the world's languages, which includes endangered and indigenous languages like Olelo Hawaii, Hawaiian, and BC First Nations languages. So which demographic do you identify with? What about your partner, your parents, grandparents, children, and grandchildren, friends and colleagues? And what language or languages are we privileging today for this workshop? English and French, the official languages, settler colonial languages of what we now know as Canada, are not in danger. Even if English and French cease to be spoken in this country that many of us call home, we still would be able to hear these languages in many other countries around the world. Discriminatory government policies, practices, linguistic ideologies in Canada, the US, and beyond continue. Genocide, assimilation, forced relocation, the 60s scoop, and residential schools are just some of the atrocities that are detrimental to Indigenous peoples and contribute to the significant decline of Indigenous languages. Indigenous languages of this country we know as Canada today share a similar history that parallels that of the US, Australia, and beyond. Across Canada, there are 11 Indigenous language families, which in total comprise more than 70 Indigenous languages. How many of these Indigenous languages can we name? British Columbia is home to 203 First Nations communities with an amazing diversity of Indigenous languages. Approximately 60% of First Nations languages in Canada are spoken right in this province, in BC, with 34 languages and 90 dialects. The data presented here and over the next few slides are from the First Peoples Cultural Council, specifically from the report on the status of BC First Nations languages from 2018. And you can see there are QR codes on each slide, and so you can use your phone to get to that report. In BC, only 3% of the First Nations population are fluent speakers of a First Nations language, and this is approximately 4,000. 90% of the fluent speakers are 45 years and older. So what happens when we no longer have access to the one language that keeps us connected to our family, to our relations, to our culture, land, and water? A wealth of knowledge is lost or no longer accessible. We can equate this to a library burning to the ground, and all that remains are ashes or little remnants and pieces that we try to put together to make sense of our world. This can be very disorienting. The view of our world is understood through a polarized filter and foreign lens. Fortunately, through language and cultural programming, communities are revitalizing and reclaiming Indigenous languages. What may seem like small-scale initiatives are indeed steps that have great impact. The results of these efforts have contributed to an emerging generation of 11,000 language learners between birth to age 24 in British Columbia. When we look at First Nations schools, where there would typically be the most support, say, for language and cultural education in comparison to, say, public education, we see here in this table that there is an average of 3 hours spent on language in First Nations operated schools per week. Nearly 5 hours per week are spent on language in Head Start or early childhood education programs. And 14 hours per week are spent on language in Language Nest preschools. Now let's compare this to other language learning opportunities in educational settings that you work, whether this is in elementary, middle or high school, or university, or other settings. Are we spending more or less than the numbers listed here? Now for a closer look at language data. Here are examples of 3 different languages from the Salishan language family. The first you see here is Hulkaminam, Hulkamelam, and Hunkaminam. So these are dialects of the same language. You have another box with Inkankapmuchin on the bottom, and then also another Salishan language with the dialect Uquamuch. So in each box, you will first see the total number of BC communities where the language is spoken. It is followed by the number of communities that are reported in this data, as well as the population. I'd like to draw our attention to the next few numbers as it indicates the number of First Nations operated schools, followed by the average hours per week spent on language. And it is important to note that this will be very different from one community to the next, even within the same language. One community may not have a First Nations operated school, while others may have a school. Some schools will offer the language more regularly or frequently than other communities, again, depending on resources that are available. The next following numbers reveal early childhood education programs, followed by language nest preschools, which are usually taught entirely in the language, with the relevant hours for each, followed by community adult language classes. The last number here indicates the number of active learners. And again, this is data just from the Salishan languages, just 3 examples, the largest family of languages in British Columbia. There are 6 other language families, and all of these languages are endangered. Again, how does this compare to languages that you teach and/or learn? In comparison to English and French and other dominant languages spoken in Canada, there are not as many Indigenous language opportunities presented to students and/or their families. Some public schools offer courses in the local Indigenous language, but this is not consistent throughout the province due to various reasons. So we can imagine that maybe there are no language teachers, there are little resources or curriculum resources available, maybe not enough student interest to run a course, and the ideology that Indigenous languages is not important and that other languages hold more value. So I share these examples because this is a current lived realities that Indigenous language learners face. There are varying degrees of documentation, archived documents that may include audio or video recordings, or maybe just written documentation. There are varying degrees of orthographies or writing systems. Sometimes in a community, there actually is no standard writing system. And in fact, there may be 3 or 4 writing systems that are currently being used. And in some communities, there are no fluent speakers remaining. Despite what may seem dire circumstances that are the results of governmental policies, Indigenous peoples continue to find ways to revitalize their respective languages so that future generations can be proud of their heritage, culture, and languages, just as other Canadians are of their respective heritages, cultures, and languages. And again, it is important to note that the official languages of Canada are not Indigenous to Canada. Here are just a few instrumental documents and policies in place within the Canadian context that address, support, and promote Indigenous languages. I encourage us all to familiarize ourselves with this as this has an impact on your students, colleagues, employees that identify as Indigenous. And I will just touch upon each of these briefly. Again, there are QR codes that will take you directly to each document or website. So I'll first begin with the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action. There are 93 calls to action and a section specifically on language. Call to action number 13 states that we call upon the federal government to acknowledge that Aboriginal rights include Aboriginal language rights. Number 16 states that we call upon post-secondary institutions to create university and college degree and diploma programs in Aboriginal languages. And number 14, we call upon the federal government to enact an Aboriginal Languages Act which now leads me to the next, which is the Indigenous Languages Act, Bill C-91. The Indigenous Languages Act received royal assent in 2019. And its purpose is to, I'm only focusing on two here, is to support and promote the use of Indigenous languages, and to support the efforts of Indigenous peoples to reclaim, revitalize, maintain, and strengthen Indigenous languages. At the second reading of the bill in the House of Commons, the Minister of Canadian Heritage and Multiculturalism, the Honourable Pablo Rodriguez, stated that it is important to acknowledge the significant role Indigenous peoples have played in Canada's history, and the importance of our relationship as a government with Indigenous peoples. The importance of that history and relationship underpins our Indigenous languages legislation. The Indigenous Languages Act is historic. Its impact will be felt by many future generations. And lastly, also in 2019, the BC Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act was passed and received royal assent in 2019. And it sets out a process to align BC's laws with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Just to re-articulate, this means that it mandates government to bring BC provincial laws into harmony with the UN Declaration. So again, I will only highlight two articles from the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and not in its entirety. Article 13, Indigenous peoples have the right to revitalize, use, develop, and transmit to future generations their histories, languages, oral traditions, philosophies, writing systems, and literatures, and to designate and retain their own names for communities, places, and persons. And Article 14, Indigenous peoples have the right to establish and control their educational systems and institutions providing education in their own languages in a manner appropriate to their cultural methods of teaching and learning. So now turning back to Hawaii and the small handful of educators and parents who made a commitment to revitalize Hawaiian. They knew that raising children in a Hawaiian language environment was central. The key would be to reestablish Hawaiian language medium education schools that once existed during the monarchy period. They focused their efforts on nurturing a new generation of speakers. Thus began the Hawaiian language revitalization movement in the 1980s. Many challenges existed, but for this group, there was nothing that could stop them. Their children were the motivation to ensure the survival of Hawaiian. From less than 50 Hawaiian language speakers under the age of 18 to more than 5,000 in a short 30-year time frame, this speaks to the efforts that were made by a handful of people who had a great vision of the future. From One Language Nest preschool, Hawaiian language medium education now includes schooling from 6 weeks of age to the doctoral degree, which can be referred to collectively as Hawaiian language medium education from cradle to career. The Kawaiʻaia family pictured on the left here is just one example and is a testament to the Hawaiian language movement, with now 3 generations of Hawaiian language speakers who are change agents that are living and breathing Hawaiian language in all domains of life in an effort to normalize the Hawaiian language. The current realities I shared reflect the similar stories of Indigenous peoples working very hard to revitalize, reclaim, and renew their Indigenous languages. Despite grand efforts to eliminate and eradicate not only the Indigenous languages of this country, but also the people, there is a great momentum to teach, learn, and find ways to normalize Indigenous languages. There is great hope, passion, and commitment by Indigenous language advocates, teachers, elders, youth, and community. So as we come to a close, I'd like for you to go to this link as listed here, or maybe you could take a photo of the QR code. This will take you to a Jamboard where you can share some of your thoughts in regards to 2 questions that I will pose. If you're using your phone, it may direct you to download an app, so if you're not able to do that, no worries. Or type in the link here on your computer, and I will also post it in the chat as well, if that is easier. All right. So I'd also like to note that comments are anonymous unless you are signed into your Google account. If you're new to Google Jamboard, I'll direct you to 2 features that we will use. The sticky note, so you'll see here, the sticky note here. Hopefully you're able to, maybe I'll use my pointer, the sticky note, or the text box. So once you click on one of these icons, you can type your comment. And since there are quite a few of us, currently 245 in the workshop, if there isn't enough room, say on the first slide here of Jamboard, please use the right arrow, which is at the top here, to navigate to another slide. So in thinking about our positionalities, whether that is an academic, a researcher from various disciplines, a language teacher, language learner, educator, practitioner, administrator, ally, I'd like for us to think about the following questions, and feel free again to jot your comments on the Jamboard. What is our responsibility to Indigenous languages here as residents of this country? And if you're joining us from other parts of the world, say from the US, what is your responsibility to Indigenous languages there? We all individually and collectively have a role and responsibility. You have the right to learn and speak your ancestral language. Our children have the right to learn and speak their heritage language or languages. It is my inherent right to learn and speak Olelo Hawaii. Indigenous peoples have the right to learn and speak their Indigenous languages. So what can we do to ensure that these languages, these Indigenous languages of this land, remain as part of the fabric of this country? So as we move from 2019, where the UN declared it the International Year of Indigenous Languages, and moving towards the International Decade of Indigenous Languages beginning next year in 2022, I'd like for us to raise our consciousness and celebrate, value, promote, and find ways to practice and live Indigenous languages today, tomorrow, and for generations to come. Eola na Olelo Oiwi, Indigenous languages shall live. Mahalo.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gaia. So if you guys have any questions, please leave them in the chat box starting now. In the meantime, you can also work on the Jamboard that Dr. Gaia has left the link for in the chat box. Just to get the conversation going, Dr. Gaia, can I ask a question about maybe how the American revitalization effort compares to the Canadian one, in your opinion?
Thanks, Kai, for that question. So within the US, there are 500 plus federally recognized communities. So again, thinking of linguistic diversity, it's quite diverse. Within California alone, I would say California and BC are similar in that California has approximately 50 or so Indigenous languages, and many of those languages are endangered as well. Some of the languages there don't have fluent speakers remaining. And so some of the communities are revitalizing or reclaiming their indigenous languages from archived documentation. Some of these languages only have written documentation, and so maybe they actually don't have any recordings of what the language actually sounds like. So, you know, I shared a little bit of the Hawaiian language situation. And Hawaii, or Hawaiian language, is, of course, unique in a sense that Hawaii is located in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, so we're quite isolated, and Hawaii only has one indigenous language. And that is very different from, say, the continental United States, or if we think of, again, Canada, where there is huge linguistic diversity. But what you do see is similar language programs. So you have Language Nest preschools in different communities across North America. Again, depending on whether it's archive documentation or human resources or language curriculum, this may look very different from one community to the next. And so, again, you may have Language Nest preschools, you may have language programs or language courses within, say, a public school system, or you may have community language programs. So it really varies. Maybe I'll just go back to this slide here. Specifically on the island of Hawaii, also known as Hawaii Island, or Hawaii itself, we have, like I mentioned, infant toddler programs, so you can enroll your child as early as 6 weeks old into this infant toddler program, which is taught entirely in Olelo, Hawaii, or operated within Olelo, Hawaii, and then they can continue to our Language Nest preschools, K through 12 education, and then they can also enter the university system. For their BA, once they've taken their foundational courses, majority of those courses will be taught through Olelo, Hawaii. And then once they reach their graduate level programs, that is taught entirely in Olelo, Hawaii as well. And so what that means is their homework, their assignments, their master's thesis, or their doctoral dissertation is written and also defended in Olelo, Hawaii. But this is really unique because this is, I would say, it's not available to everyone across the state of Hawaii. We still, again, lack the number of teachers, Hawaiian language teachers, and so we don't have enough capacity yet to offer everyone or all children in Hawaii the opportunity to learn Olelo, Hawaii.
Thank you so much for your answer. That's very cool. That's like seeing it throughout the educational span, from toddler programs to all the way to university. Something very cool and unique. We have a question from Insia. She's asking, would you know of any standardized assessments or tools in development to evaluate children's language or vocabulary or reading skills in Canada's Indigenous languages, or would further research be needed in this field? Thank you.
Thanks for that question. I know there are professors at the University of Victoria, Onawa McIver, that is working on assessment. I think you can definitely take a look at that. I would say that in regards to Indigenous languages, communities and or language learners, teachers are looking at ACTFL, but also trying to find ways to create their own assessment. And so I would definitely take a look at Dr. Onawa McIver, as she is part of a she has a SSHRC partnership grant working in partnership with other professors as well as community. And so I will just type her name in the chat so you can take a look at some of her work. One of the I didn't mention it here, but one of my colleagues and I, his name is Dr. Pila Wilson, and he is, I'll drop this link as well in the chat. It's kind of a long link, but this is a paper that we wrote as part of the book titled Teaching Writing to Children in Indigenous Languages. And so our title of the chapter is Early and Emergent Literacy Practices as a Foundation for Hawaiian Language Medium Education. And we looked at children ages 4 and 5 and how they are able to learn writing in Olelo, Hawaii. And it's through a process we call the Hakalama, or the Hawaiian syllabary. And so our children at a very young age learn this syllable or syllabary system. And because of that, they're able to apply that to writing at a very early age. So if you're interested in that, please take a look.